So I have the easy job of trying to figure out what all of that data, that great research data that you've just seen, actually means to an oil and gas company. So simple, right? I think we often, especially we're here in Ottawa, we're during a campaign, and we often think that polling results and other research, it matters a lot for policy and politicians. But what we sometimes forget is that it matters to corporate Canada as well. And so it's our companies that are actually making the investment decisions. These are multi-billion-dollar investment decisions about whether we want to proceed with our energy projects. And not just oil and gas, wind, solar, all of those energy projects. And what the public cares about matters to us too. And so, we may be scratching our heads when we think about all this data and how it seems to be sometimes contradictory. And that's us in this room. But when you're sitting down in a boardroom and trying to create a long-term strategy for your company that involves, in our case, in the oil sands, projects that are going to be built that are supposed to be lasting for decades, how do you take that data and go, okay, well, what should we do? So we have an obligation to our shareholders. And so when I look at some of this data, that really makes you wonder what the right decision is and what the right decision is for your shareholders, but also for the people of Canada. Because in the end, it is the resource that doesn't belong to us as oil and gas companies. That resource itself belongs to the people, and we just have the right to produce it. So I'm just going to pull out a few of the data points, I think, that really stood out for me. So we heard on Nick's data that nearly 8 in 10 Canadians believe our oil and gas sector can play an important long-term role at home and abroad if it operates in an environmentally responsible way. Great. As an oil and gas company, I go, okay then, 8 in 10 Canadians, I know that we're responsibly producing our oil and gas. We've reduced our emissions by about 1/3. We use primarily saline water and not very much fresh. We recycle it. We are working on mitigation to help with caribou. So responsible development, we've got it. So Canadians are in favor. So one check for us, going ahead. And then 86% of Canadians, according to Nick, feel that it's possible or somewhat possible to develop our energy resources while also protecting the environment. Great again. Canadians say that we can do it. We can produce it responsibly and go right ahead. Even better. So then we go to the other data. Research shows that only 55% of Canadians support or somewhat support growth of the oil and gas sector. So that's still a majority, but it's not exactly a resounding go for it anymore when it comes to an oil and gas company making decisions about multiple decades-long projects. And nearly half of Canadians say we should reduce oil and gas production, even if it means less economic development. So where does that leave us as an oil and gas sector when we're looking at that kind of data? And how do we create energy policy, let alone long-term business strategies that we can predict some certainty in the future? It's all about confidence. When it comes to oil and gas investment and any capital investment, we need certainty and we need confidence that what you're going to be investing in today is going to pay off in the long run. And when we see results like this, and these, while they may be more polarizing or not now, and that's what the whole conference is going to be about, they definitely create uncertainty. And there's been no doubt about that for a long time. So I think what's most frustrating to me, and it came out in all of the conversations actually so far, is that Canadians have been saying for a long time that they want a clear energy vision. And I've sat in workshops over the last decade, and these are complex issues for Canadians. Canadians are busy. They have busy lives, and it was clear from all the data that they do care about the energy industry and they do care about the environment. But they want somebody else to reassure them that it's being looked after on their behalf. And usually when you push, it's government. They say, well, we don't trust government, but yeah, it's government that has to look after this for us. And so if we keep hearing this, and we're hearing it more again in the latest data, if we're hearing that we want a national energy vision, what is stopping us from getting there? And that is frustrating, I would say to me, because a national energy vision doesn't just provide that reassurance for Canadians, but it provides reassurance for investors that are investing in this country. And I think also what's important to remember is, the oil and gas industry alone, not counting the other energy sectors, but the oil and gas industry alone is a huge component of this economy. And so that's fine. We can make decisions about whether we want to grow that or not. But we also have to think a bit more broadly about what signal does it send if we can't make decisions about our oil and gas sector, one of the largest contributors to the economy. What signal does that send more broadly about Canada in general for investors? So I'm just going to park that one because I think we'll get into that in a little bit more. You know, part of this for me too is a little bit about semantics or definitions. So we've been trying to achieve consensus at the national level, and the result is that we're stuck. And I think we can all agree with that. We are stuck. And so I more feel like what we need to be focused on is compromise, because compromise to me suggests that there are trade-offs necessary, and we were talking about those trade-offs. At a local level, we have achieved that in the oil and gas industry. I'm going to go to an example that we have at our company. So we operate, for those of you who don't know Cenovus well, we have oil and gas operations in Alberta and BC, but primarily we're in situ oil sands producer. So we pump the oil to get it out of the ground. Most of our neighbors are Indigenous communities. Those are our closest neighbors. We've been there for more than 2 decades. And so when I talk about consensus versus compromise, we've actually signed 9 long-term agreements with 9 different communities, 9 different Indigenous communities. Those weren't easy to do. But when we went to those communities, you know, we both had different asks, and we both had different things that we were trying to achieve. In the end, what we wanted as a company and what those communities wanted was long-term certainty. So we're going to be there for decades in those communities. And so we sat down at the table together, and it wasn't 1 meeting and it wasn't 2, and it's never easy, but they came to us with, this is what we want from you as a company, and we went to them with, this is what we would expect from you as a community and as a partner with us on these projects. And in the end, we were able to sign those agreements, 9 of them, and we have good relationships with others. And it's because we were able to realize that we had to each give. There's always got to be those trade-offs, which was also discussed. And there's something that we have to be able to learn from that. I know Positive Energy, and Mike, you did a lot on communities in the first phase, but there has to be something that we can learn from what we've been able to achieve. If the people closest to those projects are able to achieve compromise and work together, then why can't we achieve that when we get up to a higher level? If it's the people that are being the most impacted by those projects that can actually get past their differences, how can we not get there as a nation? And so I think that that's something that's really important for us to think about too. You know, I have discussions all the time about energy as part of my job, and I've stood in front of classrooms, I've stood at open houses for pipeline projects and answered questions there. We take people of all different backgrounds and political beliefs and other beliefs up to our oil sands operations and tour them. And when you're face to face in a room like this, where we can look each other in the eye, it's not a polarizing debate. So there are lots of times when I'm talking to people that have a different viewpoint than I do about how much oil and gas development should happen in this country, how it should happen, where our focus should be. But when you sit down and talk together as Canadians, you know, the research shows that Canadians have a lot of shared interests. We care about the economy, we care about our jobs, but we also care about the environment. And when you're face to face with somebody, it turns into a discussion about solutions. So each person brings up their concerns, but you go into the solution space. Somehow we lose that, again, along the way when we bring it up to that higher national level. It no longer becomes about that solutions discussion. It becomes about an either or. We can either have this or we can have that. And it's not about an and. It's not about how we can achieve that solution so that it's the and. And I think, again, that's what we have the challenge in front of us. And I wish I was up here offering solutions instead of pointing out what the challenges are. But I do think there are examples of where those solutions are happening. And so we just need to make it, we have to have the will to make it happen on a national level. You know, I used to be a journalist, so I can say we can blame a lot of things for the polarization. I worked in newsrooms for 15 years. We can blame that if everything is politicized now, and the energy industry and the environment and policy, they're very politicized, so you have to choose one political party or the other. If you're voting X party, that means that you care about the environment, but you don't care about the economy. And if you're voting for this party, you care about the economy, but you don't care about environment. That's not how most people think, but that's what the political system has forced us into. In journalism, you have to go out there and you're told, and I told people this in my newsrooms, tell a balanced story, go tell both sides of the story. But the problem with that is that what a balanced story ends up being is you have the extreme this side and you have the extreme this side, and the reporter says, well, I balanced the story because I have both sides. But it's not truly a balanced story because you've missed that entire big group of people's opinion in the middle. And so, that's causing polarization. I won't even get into social media. But in the end, I don't think it matters what's caused it. What we're here to talk about is how do we get past that? I found it really interesting that Canadians say that the national interest is more important than local interests. And I'm interested to talk a bit more with Nick about that. But, where I went right away is, yeah, they say that, but they feel like their interest is the national interest. So, if I'm sitting in Quebec, well, yeah, the national interest is very important, but in their minds, the national interest is reflective of what they and all their neighbors in downtown Calgary. Well, we're doing this for the benefit of the national interest. Yeah, the national interest, your view of national interest might not be what the view of national interest is in PEI. And so, I think that that's something that's important when we're reading into this data to remember. National interest now has changed, and that's become very obvious in the oil and gas industry. I think before, national interest quite often meant as long as you're doing everything right with a project to not harm the environment, and that you're taking the proper precautions and the proper steps necessary in improving it, the national interest really turned out to be economically, this is in the best interest of the public. These days, it's a lot more difficult, and that is why it's so polarized now. Now, what's the difference between the economic national interest, the environmental national interest, and the social national interest? And I think that that's where we sit today, is how do you weight those? And I don't know what the answer is, and you talked about that, Stephen and Nick, you both talked about that, is that in the end, somebody has to make a decision. And we have to force Canadians to decide, where's that line? Where do we draw the line? When is it okay to sacrifice, because there has to be some sacrifice, something when it comes to the environment for the benefit of jobs? Or are we willing to sacrifice those jobs so that we can say Canadians are fighting climate change, we're a leader compared to all other countries? As long as we're doing that with our eyes wide open is what my last thing that I'll say is, because we have to know, and I think that is where the problem lies, and that's where when you see Stephen's research showing you that people are in favor of oil and gas projects going ahead, and it's still okay for climate change, but not pipeline projects go ahead. Eyes aren't wide open right now, and I don't have that solution because people are busy in their daily lives. They want to be informed, but they don't have time to sit there and read an hour every night of energy and environmental data. So that's a challenge for our industry, is how do you get that information out there to them in an easy to read manner that still has an impact. And I think that's the challenge for everyone else in this room too. I will leave it at that.
Okay, is this working? How about, I'm going to do like 4 rapid fire. It's going to be like rapid fire responses to what we've just heard. It's interesting when you talked about stability. The interesting thing in the polling numbers is not only I would hazard to say that companies need stability, Canadians want stability. Actually, if we were to summarize 30 years of polling experience of advice that Canadians have to politicians, would be don't mess things up. It would just basically be as simple as that. So. And the other thing, and this is, we're kind of freelancing here, but Stephen, for you and Eric and myself, I think one of the things that we haven't unpacked are perceptions of risk related to, so trade-offs, but perceptions of risk that Canadians might have depending on different paths. Because it's okay for them to say, I don't like something, and then you need to introduce, well, these are the potential risks that are involved in option A versus option B. So that's the first point. Second point about the national interest. Yes, at trumping or overriding local interests until it's in your neighborhood. That's basically kind of the caveat. And I'd also hazard to say that if there are 50 energy projects and 49 are doing well, the only one that's going to be in the newspaper is the one that's not going well. So how do you deal with that media perception and how to manage that? I quite liked Stephen's comments about diversity of energy sources and the energy superpower riff. I think that's missing. So now I'd like, I said I had 10 steps to policy sanity. Step 1 was it's complex. I'd like to add a step 2. Step 2 is we have options. There's been a significant focus on carbon, which is nothing wrong with focusing on carbon because there needs to be a focus on carbon. However, if we want to talk to Canadians about this, we need to say that there's water power, there's nuclear power, there's all different kinds of options out there. And I would say step 2 to sanity on this is to kind of put everything on the table as an option and to see how everything can potentially coherently fit together, as opposed to making this a contest, a popularity contest on whether you like or dislike carbon. On the transition front that Marisa and also Stephen had some data on, I think, Stephen, I'd like to go back to my data, and I think you and Eric should look at your data because when we think of potential polarization points, the research that we've done in Canada, the United States, the UK, other countries, Germany, educational attainment has been a key driver of polarization, right? And we should look at that. And I'd like to say, I am hostage, and Stephen and Eric are hostage to the environment within which they have done the polling, field dates. And Stephen talked about this. So when news things happen when you're in the field, it's not ideal from a research perspective. And we've just come off a period where, as someone that's in the field every night, for the last 15 days, it's been 34, 33, 33, 35, 35, 32, 32, 33. It's been the most polarized environment that we're looking at right now. And this goes back to the question before about Stephen Harper, the influence that Stephen Harper or Justin Trudeau might have on the numbers. The fact that we happen to be polling at a time where there is polarization, if we had taken those same questions and done them 2 years ago when it was Liberals 45, Conservatives 28, we'd be reporting, look at the Liberal numbers and how there's a consensus emerging on this. So we have to be careful. But I think those other structural things like size of community, gender, how about age when we talk about transitions? Stephen had that slide about age. I'd be like, I wonder if younger people are more impatient than older people. Do older people want to kick the can and not pay the bill? So I think that's another thing for us to kick around. But I think this has all been quite interesting. I'm kind of energized. Are you pumped? No, sorry.
Okay.
Solutions.
Okay. Well, thanks to all the panelists, and I'm just going to open it up for general questions in a second. But what I'd like to do is, I guess, panel chair prerogative, take the first question. Nick, I can't remember how many steps you got into in your 10-point program. You got to 2. Okay. Well, I'm going to suggest a third. Is that when we're talking to each other, we should actually be saying something. And for about the last 30 years,
Are you talking about the panel?
we'll leave it to the rest to judge when we're done. And I was struck by Rhona, your comment on the big consensus that we need that the national interest should prevail. There's a big consensus, at least among elites, that we should all have a national energy vision or an energy strategy. But we also know, and I think your research shows this, and I'm going to ask you to comment, it's certainly shown in the transition research that Marisa talked about. It's not overstating it too much to suggest that there are as many definitions of the word transition as there are users. And that very much came out, and I think probably came across in Marisa's comments. So I guess my point really is sometimes it seems to be it's not so much is it polarizing or not polarizing as it's, maybe put it, nolarizing, and we're just not getting anywhere. We're just talking past each other. Observations from your research and from your experience as to why that is, and are there ways past it?
Can I jump in? Good. So as I was listening to this, I think I've actually come up with two things that I would love to see and sort of observations and thoughts. The first is we need a much better conversation and set of information about costs and trade-offs. Nick alluded to this. I think you talked about this. We're not having that conversation, and we're not getting good information on this. That information is coming from all sorts of different interests. The first question I look at whenever I look at a set of information is, who's giving me this information? Because that's going to color what they do. And I think I'm going to plug academia right now. It's groups like this and other groups at other universities that need to be producing this information, but at some point or another, it needs to move into the national conversation. And typically, these kinds of conversations don't go much further than that. And so I think the real challenge is for government to say, yeah, we're going to create a national commission, but not only that, we're going to ask them to provide a really serious set of information, and we're going to then give them the latitude and the resources to put that information out to the Canadian public. It'll be neutral, it'll be nonpartisan in nature, and it'll be high scale and highly available, right? So I think that would improve the conversation, but we don't have yet a political party that's in power that's yet willing to do anything like that at the scope and scale that I'm talking about to make better decisions. The second concern I have has to do with structure. And that's the basic structure of institutions that we see in a lot of democracies right now. We are moving, in the context of polarization, we are seeing whipsaw governments. So from the Obama years to the Trump years, from the Harper years to the Trudeau years, right? We are seeing governments come into power and just, it's like, we're going 60 miles an hour this way. Whoa, we're going 60 miles an hour this way, right? And that's because of polarization, and it's also, frankly, because of the nature of our political institutions that allow for that, whether you're talking about presidentialism in the United States or parliamentary. Quite frankly, the Liberals had a proposal that they completely abandoned because they realized it would harm their own party, which was to look at proportional representation, which is a system that tends to create less whipsaw systems. So there may be some value in Canadians starting to look at some sort of actual adjustment or options on the table to reduce the degree of whipsaw actions amongst government. And the last point I'll make is there's so much I didn't get a chance to show you. We have the data on age, we have the data on education, we have the data on gender. You want to see increasing polarization? Let's talk about men and women, right? And we know in the US we have really good data on this. Men's opinions and women's opinions about a wide range of issues are further apart than they were in 1975, right? Increasing, right? Absolutely, and I'm quite sure it's reflective data here in Canada. So it's quite interesting. We're seeing polarization across a wide variety of areas. The question, the next steps for the group are how on earth do we start to address these challenges if we see them as a problem, and I do to some degree.
I just want to add to that. Anyone that knows me has heard me harping about the lack of data in this country. And this is an emotional discussion, but we still need the data to back it up. And I'm not sure if anyone from NRCan is in the room, but I know there is a step going forward, at least at the national level, to create a data center. But it's still going to be a long ways off from the kind of data that you're talking about, so that we can compare those trade-offs for sure. So we need that, we need that, we need that. I can't say it more. And then just, Mike, to add to yours, you said we need to be saying things that are meaningful, but I think too we need to be listening. And that's maybe the bigger problem, is that we just keep talking over each other, and we're trying to just make our point without listening to the other side enough.
Nick?
Yeah, if I could just add, so we're 3 steps closer, Mike, with your 3rd step to doing something. I think one of the challenges that we have is that, in our research, and this is clear in other countries, that the research that I've seen is that there are fundamentally 2 types of citizens. Those that are literally, for some of you have heard me say this before, I'll be very short, some that are very literal and evidence-based, and others that are symbolic and emotional. And we're very good at having more proof points. but that just means that we disconnect with people that automatically have an opinion just based either for or against a particular proposition just because of how they feel about things. So, so not only do we have to say something, but we have to connect in a way that individuals, regardless of whether they want to read the fine print and want another proof point, or whether they just want to hear we're going to fix the environment and are not into the details, that we can connect with them. On the definitional front, I think one of the things that we can improve in our research is what does, and this goes back to the question before, what is national interest? Does that mean the national interest overrides? And just to be straight up on that, and whether people are willing to accept that. The other thing on the transition front, I think the other thing that we maybe need to have a talk about is sequencing of decisions. Sequencing of starting off with how do we make decisions, who's involved in making those decisions, and then making decisions. But the problem with that is that it requires a long-term strategy. To Stephen's point about whipsaw governments, how can this happen government to government in a long period of time when governments might change, when you have whipsaw governments and we don't even have a consensus on how to make a decision? So maybe one of the things we could talk about and explore is how do we sequence good public policy that is a little more, not nonpartisan, bipartisan, where at least we know that if there's a change in government, Canadians and the sector and everyone knows that, you know what, we have a plan. We've kind of agreed on some things. We haven't agreed on everything, but regardless of who's in power, this plan can incrementally move forward.
Okay, well, thank you, Nick. And we're just going to open it up. We have about 15 minutes or a little bit more, and lots of people with questions. And we'll start over there.
Great presentations this morning. Thank you so much. A lot to think about. I have a two-part question. One, based on what you mentioned, and it's odd that Rhona mentioned NRCan. I was thinking NRCan, I think it was about right before Harper took office. Their theme for energy with the interprovincial group was our diversity is our strength. So looking for a voice for all energy in Canada. If we were to look at an entity that did that, what would be the risks associated with an entity that would take that on? It's almost limitless, I think. Or what advice would you want to give an entity like that? And part two, a few weeks ago, I attended a breakfast from the Alberta Eco Trust that Dave Collier moderated. And during their Q&A, a question was asked that I want to repeat here. And somebody stood up and said, what's wrong with polarization? Can't the best men win? Why have a voice for everyone? So that's why I'm asking it in two parts. One is, how do we do that, not just talk about it? And secondly, there are groups that are ingrained that say polarization is just fine. So your comments around both of those would be really beneficial, I think, to the group and to myself in particular.
Okay, anyone on the panel?
I can start. You know, I like the diversity question because we're all told at all of our companies, of course, the company is going to be stronger if there's diversity of thought, if there's diversity. So that should equal, if we have a diversity of opinions about energy and environment in this country, that means we have a stronger policy in the end. It still, I think, comes back to that, the trade-offs, and I keep thinking that. So you're right. How do we bring that together, though? How do we get that diversity of thought? But in the end, we keep having discussions about it, and we have the diversity of thought. And I'm in multiple discussions, but somebody in the end has to make a decision. And I think that's what's stopping that. So we need somebody to do that for sure.
Oh, sorry. So two quick, I'll try to answer both questions, but I'm going to do them in reverse way. My concerns for polarization are severalfold. The first is when you have really extreme viewpoints, you get the whipsaw effect. And so that's something that I worry about, right? You lose that degree of policy certainty that companies are so dependent on, and that frankly we all are so dependent on. I would never expect to see a democratic process that's operating with pure consensus. It's just never going to happen. So it's all about the degree of extremities that exist within the public opinion context. So that's my concern for for extreme or higher levels of polarization. And I might add also that when you have that degree of disagreement, you've got you've got two different sets of people that operate from purely different sets of information. So there are arguments right now that in the United States and to a lesser degree in Canada, we have people who live in the Bostons and New York Cities of the world versus the people who live in rural Texas, and they literally operate under completely different sets of information about how the world functions, right? And that, boy, if everybody can't agree that gravity exists, we've got a problem, right? And so that's why I worry about that. The second would be institutionalizing some degree of independence. There is a little bit of I like the model of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the United States, which has 5 appointed commissioners, and they're appointed on a nonpartisan basis, alternating between Republicans and Democrats, and they operate usually on consensus. It's become a little more politicized recently, not surprisingly in the US, but an independent commission with a lot of power to think about and make decisions about energy decision making. That's one model. I don't think it's the only model for trying to address this. We've been bouncing these ideas around. And there, the only advice would be to inform yourself with as much input from both stakeholders and from scientists. They have 1,000 people that work for them. And they're developing a huge amount of information, and staff reports from FERC go to the commissioners and are very influential.
Okay, Nick, and then we've got a lot of questions
Okay.
in the room, so just if everybody could.
Super fast. So on your NRCan comment, I think that's valid, and I think we need actually energy education. I think in the olden days, if I can say olden days, when I was a kid, I remember going to school in Ontario, and I knew about the importance of the nuclear sector to the province and prosperity. Kids learned about that. They knew about that. Now we know nothing. We're energy illiterate. We're democratically illiterate, but we're energy illiterate. So, we need our educational system to step up in order to make for good citizens that can make informed decisions. On the polarization front, A, polarization is valid. B, it is not optimal. That's like saying, yeah, let's have minority governments in perpetuity, switching back and forth. This goes back to what Canadians want, stability and not a lot of risk. So I think the polarization creates instability. People can't plan their lives. Businesses can't plan decisions. It's valid. It's entertaining, for sure. But, I think if minority, this polarization is good for fringe groups. It's not good for the mainstream. So if you're a fringe group, you want polarization, you want division, because then these fringe groups have a disproportionate influence on public policy dialogue because the mainstream groups are hostage. Let's just use Angela Merkel, good chancellor, impressive woman, great leader, European leader. She can't form a government. She's out, right? Because of polarization and fringe groups blocking her from her ability in these whipsaw-type situations that Stephen's talking about.
Okay, question over here.
Yeah, so I want to bridge Stephen's data with Nick's data. I agree 100% with Stephen's data that the #1 indicator of party support right now is climate change. If I ask you what your opinion is on climate change, I have a pretty good idea of where that is, and that overlaps with region, and it overlaps with urban-rural, and so you get multiple cleavages. What I want, and this is where Nick's time sequence data comes in, when did that begin? How long has this been going on that we see these stark partisan differences? Because as political scientists, we used to ask very different questions about party support 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Is this a 4-year phenomena? Is this a 10-year phenomena?
I would hazard to say, and this goes back to the question, it started with Justin Trudeau as soon as he put it on the agenda as one of the keystone initiatives for the Liberal government. So now, whether this continues, a lot of these things are dependent with who the leaders are of the federal parties and what they decide on this issue. And there's a significant amount of dependence on that front. So this goes back to Justin Trudeau putting it on the agenda. Stephen Harper also putting it on the agenda, but in a different way. But on the environment front, it's definitely started with Justin Trudeau because he is the Prime Minister, and making it a priority creates a battle line for people either to like or dislike the government of the day.
Okay, any other comments on that, or should we? Oh,
Nick, in your data, the one non-polarizing factor was everybody loves renewables. So my question is about the assertion that everybody loves renewables. And let's take wind power, for example. In this province, if you go to Kingston, Ontario, and ask people how they like the wind turbines in Wolf Island, you better get ready for a long and angry response. If you go to Huron County, where the Liberals lost 5 seats several elections ago, largely because of the wind turbines, you find that it's still a case that it's very unpopular. So these numbers that show the popularity of renewables are at a very high 35,000-foot level of abstraction. But when the turbines actually arrive, in some cases they're welcomed because they provide revenue for farmers, and in other cases people detest them. It's interesting that the Ford government has taken away the municipal option, the Liberals put in a municipal option, took it away rather, and the Conservatives brought it back, and therefore there aren't going to be any wind turbines, many in Eastern Ontario. So what happens in a transition where we move away from fossil fuels and we move to renewables, and we have 10 times as many wind turbines across the country? And can you imagine what the reaction would be in the Straits of Juan de Fuca or the Georgia Strait of the Salish Sea if we had 500 wind turbines to replace fossil fuels? What would Elizabeth May and her constituents think about that, do you believe?
So I don't disagree with what you're saying, and actually the data that we've done on a number of other projects, including the stuff for Positive Energy, explains this. So when we talk about the popularity of renewables, people just think of it in terms of relative to other options. So you just have to think of this as a default positive view relative to other things that they're asked to score. But you've actually put your finger on a much more structural, foundational challenge that's important, is that the problem that everyone should have in common is the ability to deliver and deploy a project. Actually, it doesn't matter whether it's a wind turbine, a hydro project, nuclear power project, coal project, whatever it is, but the ability to actually have any type of project. I would hazard to say in some of these communities, people are against having a shopping mall built. So should it be surprising that they're against any kind of energy project? And I think, the focus should actually be, back to my ecumenical comment, is everyone has an interest in figuring out a way to get any kind of energy project approved. Because as soon as you transition from the idea, to your point, the idea of wonderful wind, I'll just say that, to a project, then it's kind of like, well, hold on a second. I like wind when it wasn't in my neighborhood, and it seemed like a theoretical concept further away, and I like it because I like the look of wind turbines. And we've done projects where people have said, I like the look of wind turbines, but where I like the look of that compared to something else, to where you actually have a project. So maybe as part of now maybe we're at 4 steps now, Mike. How do we get a project done? Let's forget about which project it is. How in this environment do you get a project done? Because as soon as it's a project, you run into those exact valid problems that, if it was something other than wind, it would still be, the same things would still happen because people are against projects.
okay, Stephen, did you?
Oil tanker, transmission line, gas plant, wind turbine, geothermal project, hydro project, it doesn't matter. There's the very first lesson in my energy policy class is there is no silver bullet, and no community wants any of this near them. NIMBY is still alive and well. I mean, we're very careful to not call it that anymore because it has a pejorative sense to it, but there are aspects of it everywhere. I'll leave it at that.
On that cheerful note, Ron, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in, or maybe we'll go on to the next question. Okay, next question.
As tempting as it might be to follow up on those rabbit tracks that nothing could be built anywhere, I think I have a fair amount of experience on how to actually do it better than Ontario and end up without people running pitchforks in the streets. But I want to go back to a different issue, which is fundamentally struck me when you were both looking at data. You were looking at it from regions, and you were looking at the difference between the West. Oh, but BC gets a special status because it's demonstrably different, or you get Atlantic Canada or whatever. But it really is some work that I did recently with Quest and Pollution Probe. We surveyed all the governments across the country, energy regulators, utilities, and we're looking at that transformation. And it became very clear that provinces look quite at this issue quite differently depending upon their resources and not just where they're located. So you would find, I think, a certain amount of affinity and opinions between Newfoundland and Alberta, which you very rarely put together. You would certainly find that Manitoba and Quebec and Newfoundland to some degree as well, and BC, the hydro provinces, have a view about where the transformation should be going in energy priorities and policies that are really quite different. And I think that you might find something very interesting if you sliced and diced your data a little bit on the common factors that exist in different provinces and cluster together rather than just looking at, because you put New Brunswick together with Ontario and looking at nuclear, you'd find a different thing, and instead you keep burying all of these nuances. And I just want to, by all means, comment on it, but it leads then to another piece that often is missing on the national dialogues and what the national interest is. When it comes to energy, it still is a provincial jurisdiction. When it comes to energy and the impacts of it, it's often still within the different kind of markets, culture, approaches and ethos that have been developed in each of the provinces, not the regions. And then you get this overarching national interest on climate change, which is a global interest. And we need to come and bridge that and recognize that when we're trying to come up with national solutions. And I think that Trudeau was very fortunate in the first part of his term, not so much today. But any comments on that?
Okay, just any comments from the panel, and then probably one last question. One of the first hands up was over here. We'll see how we do on short comments from the panel.
5 seconds. Yes. We're going to cut all of this data a million different ways to send. And we actually have we can geolocate where people actually live. So we're close to the first 3 digits of their postal code.
Yeah, I was a little worried for a second.
Oh,
This is being recorded, Stephen.
we have
We're not geolocating anyone, and also, we're not. Just so you know, camera.
we have cameras in their homes. No, I'm kidding. And so we're going to cut that down a lot more. I'll just leave it at that.
If I could add, in addition to in addition to the team working out a polarization definition, I think it would be valid for us to have an energy context definition that we could cut across all our research that would have that, like what's the energy context in New Brunswick and the energy context in Ontario, so that when we're doing our analysis, we can add that as a separate dimension, because I think it'll add more insight into how the nuance of opinion. So I like that idea.
Okay.
So Ginny Flood with Suncor Energy. One of the pieces that I find missing in the conversation I like the last comment about a definition of energy, but energy is more than just electricity. And when you look, we tend to have a conversation on whether we're going to develop the fossil fuel sector as an extraction conversation, not a use and consumption conversation. And when you think about it from a use and consumption, you think about it from a perspective of there's a lot of different types of industry that use our product as a commodity and a feedstock. So whether it's the petrochemical industry, whether it's the transportation industry, whether it's marine, aviation, but we never have a conversation with them in the room. And at the moment, when you think about it, over 6,000 products are made from a feedstock from fossil fuels. And I think when we're looking at this, and when you're thinking about trade-offs, we have to be thinking about it in that interconnectivity, not just as, you know, a fossil fuel that we extract. It actually is about 20%. When you look at consumption use, it's about 80% of emissions. And that's where you actually start getting into the big questions about trade-offs and what are people willing to give up. Because you have to understand what the product's used for in order to understand what you're giving up. And my last comment is, I find that we have often a domestic conversation for a global issue. And, you know, I heard a comment a few weeks ago what it said, if you're looking for problems, you're going to find lots more problems. But if you're looking for opportunities, you're going to find a lot more opportunities. We have to shift the conversation to what is the opportunity for Canada, not what is the problem.
Okay, panelists, last thoughts or comments, and then I'm sorry, I apologize to other people who had their hands up, but I'm going to have to bring it to a close. But last words.
So this was helpful to me as a researcher, and I would suggest that any other ideas that you have, please send them to Monica and her team, because we all need to kind of coordinate and leverage everything, and every bit of insight and recommendation that you have helps makes our products even better. So this was great. Thanks.
Rhona?
Yeah, and I think, Jenny, just to add to your point, it's, you know, climate is definitely a global conversation, but I think also, how do we go from that global conversation to what hits home in the family, in your house? Because right now, this is just kind of a nuanced energy and environment up there. But until people understand what it means to them personally, we're not going to solve this problem of the polarization.
Stephen?
I just, you know, I think the last piece in this is thinking about costs. And they're everywhere, and we don't have a good handle on them. So if we're thinking about costs to the economy and benefits to the economy, this is on the upstream and the downstream end of all of these different kinds of energy profiles. We do not have a very good comprehensive picture. And it also means things like, I got Lyme disease this summer. Lyme was a non-existent disease in northern New York 15 years ago. It's now in the Gatineau, right? And in our particular hospitals and healthcare system was overwhelmed with Lyme disease cases this particular summer. We're talking something like 5,000 of them in a county of 100,000 people. Think about that for a second. My particular cost on that was $1,600. Welcome to the U.S. healthcare system, right? That's a cost as well. So we need to be thinking about all of these costs comprehensively, subsidies for the fossil fuel and the renewable industry, everything, right? Across the board, think about what these things are costing us and get that information in a parsimonious way to the Canadian public.
Okay, and on that note, we're a little over time, so if you'll please just join me in thanking our panelists. And Monica, I'll leave it to you to get us back convened. In the meantime, I believe it's time for a brief break. So.